Another useful NPR technique is half-toning. Half-toning is, I don't know whether you've ever looked at newspaper images, I'm sure you have. A newspaper images isn't made up from gradated image tones, or a photograph is not made up from gradated image tones, it's made up from small black dots on a white background. There's no half-tones in there at all. It's either black or white. And the illusion of grey tones is given by the size of the dots. We can recreate that very easily in the render tree, and I'll show you how. I've got our cartoon mouse here, and we'll take a preview of it there. That's just a straightforward Lambert Shader, I think it is in there. Have a look in the render tree. No material in there at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a Lambert Shader and plug directly into it, into the surface there. Okay, exactly as you'd expect. Now, what we do, in fact, is we use the Lambert Shader to drive size parameters in a procedural texture. The procedural texture that we're going to use is a grid. Let's pull down a grid, texture grid. Now if I plug the grid directly into that surface there and play around with some of the parameters, we can make a fairly respectable dot in there. You'll notice that the texturing is slightly different on the eyes and on the rest of it. I've fairly carefully textured this in the texture editor so that we don't get any pinches that we normally get from spherical mappings on complex objects like this. Now in the advanced section we have here, we're going to do a little bit of tiling. I'm going to tile it up a fair old bit there. You're starting to see some dots form there. I'm going to make him black and white in the dots, and that's pretty much all we need to do. So we've got some reasonably respectable dots in there. The other advantage, of course, of texturing, of getting the UV coordinates correct in there, is that we get a fairly even size of dot across the surface of this character, which is also quite important. Okay, so we've got a grid in there, but of course the dots are all the same size, so how do we change the size of the dots? It's actually pretty straightforward. We just look for our Lambert node, Lambert there, which we had but we've lost because the render tree has an irritating way of losing nodes for you when you refresh things. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to drive the U and the V width of the grid. Let's just go back in here and you can see what that does here. The U and the V width control the gaps in between the circles. Let's make that really nice and hard and make that quite big there. Okay. If I turn the diffusion down, you can see that it is in fact a grid, and the U and V widths control the actual thickness of the gaps in between the grid, and the diffusion is just a softness factor. So if you soften it there, it starts to become rather like circles where those hard-edged squares have been softened into something a little bit more circular. There's also a contrast parameter in there which controls the amount of contrast between the two colours that you put in there, but we don't need that, so we won't bother. Okay, so we know that we can change the width of those gaps there. This is where it gets interesting. The Lambert shader can be used to change those UV widths across the surface. So where the Lambert shader, plug it in there so that you can see, where the Lambert shader on this surface is quite bright, it's going to make quite large widths, and where the Lambert shader is dark, it's going to make quite small widths. Let's put the grid back in there and put the Lambert shader into the U width and the V width. Again, we're plugging an RGB output into a scaler, so there's a converter has been put in there for us. We'll take it directly from the scaler there, again because we can do without two colour scalers. Now you can see we're starting to get a certain amount of dot patterning going on there, but it's way too broad. The white distribution is way too broad, and we're not seeing much of the dark, so we're not seeing much in the way of shading. Also, for these kind of things, you do need to put the anti-aliasing up reasonably high, because these little dots can get lost in the aliasing if you're not careful. So how do we get rid of that really broad white area there? Well, again, quite simple. We use a math change range node. Now, if we assume that the breadth of the values coming out of this colour to scalar after they've gone through the Lambert are in the range 0 to 1, that's obviously the wrong range. So the change range node, which we've looked at previously here, can be used to adjust that range into something that's more favourable. I've just plugged it into the wrong thing. So that it's more favourable. It defaults to 0.1 being remapped to 0.2 to 1. I'm going to fiddle around with these values until we get something approaching what we're looking for. I'm also cheating a little bit because obviously I've played with this before, so I do have an idea of what the values should be. It's not always quite this easy to get it right, but there. Now, and there you can start to see the shading forming in there. We've got some quite dark colours in there, bright colour around there. I think one of our lights is a shadow casting light. See how it all drops out for the shadowing there as well. If I move around the side here where we've got a bit more contrast in the imagery, you'll get to see that happening a little bit better. Now, don't make the mistake here of believing that there's any shades of grey in this, apart from the slight softness of the dots. That shading is all being defined by the size of the dots on this shader. It's a nice effect. I think we're burning out a little bit in the top there. Let's see whether we can just get rid of that. By remapping that there. You can see as I change these values how it affects the overall shading. That's not made a great deal of difference there. Let's just put a really big value in there and see what that does. Again, not an awful lot. Let's put a really big value in and see. If you're not sure what's happening with something, give it a really large value or a really small value. Push it right to the limit so you can get a feel for it. That's made it more contrasty, so obviously we want to go in the other direction there. 0.8, what does that do? That opens it back out again. Seems to be having more effect in the darker areas, in fact. But yeah, it's spilling those dots into some of the lighter areas a bit more for us. By fiddling around with that a bit more, you can get that to look really good. If I change that to 0.6 in the range there, there's only a certain amount of deduction going on in the numbers that I'm putting in here. I know that changing some values will affect the darker areas and other values will affect the lighter areas. You can see by changing this value here from 0.4 to 0.6, we've got a lot more density in the blacks. But overall, that's really quite a nice effect. And as I said, even shadows drop out of this. We've got a shadow casting light in there. If I just come down here, you can see where the shadow is casting off the nose there. Even that drops out of it. It's really very, very effective. There are other textures that you can use for this. You could use a checkerboard texture and use the Lambert Shader to adjust the size of the squares. But this one is by far the most effective. You can also combine this with the toon shader. You could use a toon shader to put a nice black or even coloured line around the contours of this. I really like this. This is a very effective shader. As I said before, you do have to be quite careful about how you apply textures in this way, because using traditional spherical texture mapping, for example, you get a lot of pinching at the top and a lot of spreading around these areas here, and the illusion isn't complete. I'll just show you what this UV mapping looks like there, if I can. It's in there somewhere. No, I can't. There's an example scene on the CD though, so you should be able to have a look at that and see what I've done. So that just about covers half-toning. Now this is half-toning which is procedural. It is possible to do half-toning type texturing using hand-painted textures. The technique is slightly different, but it's also quite remarkably effective. I'm going to use a sphere for this. I'm not going to use this head because, again, it requires some fairly carefully texturing, and I think it's a little easier to see what's going on if we use a sphere. So bear with me just 1 second while I delete that head and get rid of some of these lights in here and get a sphere there. Okay, that's a sphere. Now, the basic technique of this method is to try and break down this sphere into two areas of light and dark, two fairly well delineated areas of light and dark, so that we've got something that we can apply textures to. And what we have is a kind of a light color texture and a dark color texture that I've prepared before. You'll see those in a minute, and we map the light texture into the lighter areas and the dark texture into the darker areas. Let's run through it, and you'll see, or it'll become clearer how we approach this as we go along. Right, we have the default scene material Phong in there. I'm going to get a Lambert shader for that sphere there. Okay, and that's it. Now, what we do is we use a we get a gradient texture which we've looked at before, and we plug it into the surface directly. Now, if you remember from previous videos, the 2D texture from the texture generators menu here has got an input node that we can use to force the gradient into a color lookup table, and by plugging the Lambert shader into there, and if you remember going into the input and changing the vector input, which is the default, into a scalar input there, the Lambert shader has been converted into a scalar and goes through into the input, and then from there into the surface. Let's have a quick look at that. That's a fairly vibrant looking image going on there, and that's because the default gradient texture is actually fairly vibrant as well. Open its property page up and have a look at the gradient there. Now we're going to modify this. We get rid of a lot of this rubbish in here and make something considerably more simple. There, and there. Change this one, I think, to a black. Let's see. Yes, that one to a black. This one to a white, and this one also to a white. So we've got now a monochrome key. It's not so very different from the straightforward Lambert shader, but it's quite bright. Now, if I drag this marker down here real close and bring this right up here like that, look how we get a sharp edge there. Remember when we looked at the cartoon shader, the toon shader earlier on, where we get these very hard edges on there? Well, that's exactly the same technique for this. We've got a little bit of a hiccup in there. That's caused by the lighting. I'm just going to see whether I can make a simpler lighting setup there, because it simply works better there. Okay, that looks a little bit more like a sphere. You can adjust the sharpness of that by pulling these values around here, but pulling the gradient around a little bit. We can make a very soft fall off. We can make a really soft fall off there. Okay. And there, make it really soft. But we're looking initially at least for something fairly hard. So there, like that. Okay, so how does this help us with our natural texturing? Well, what it does is it gives us a key which we can feed into a mix2 nodes. Here we go, mixes, mix2 colors node. That plugs into the weight of the mix2 nodes, and if I then plug the mix2 colors, beg your pardon, then if I plug the output of the mix2 colors into the surface there, we get, as you'd expect, two colors. We've kind of been through this before, but I'll run through it very briefly. Red and green. Now I can get texture nodes. I can get two image texture nodes here and plug them into the inputs, the color inputs. Where are we? There and there. I haven't put a texture on this sphere, a texture projection on this sphere yet, so let's do that. There, new UV texture. There, and the same for this one. Now we already have a UV texture projection. Okay, let's just turn down the aliasing so that it speeds up a little bit in its rendering. There. So we now have the no icon image, which is directly fed into the mix 2 colour. Sorry, I'm running out of space a little bit here, so I'm going to try and tidy this up so that we can see what's happening. I'll disconnect those because we're not using shadows just at the moment there. So a no icon, 2 no icon images which are going into the mix 2, into the 2 colour inputs of the mix 2 colours node, and we are using our gradient to drive the mix between the two. Obviously you're seeing no difference along this band here because we've got 2 identical images. So let's put different images in there. Here, new from file, and I've prepared these earlier. There, these are hand painted crosshatches. I've done them in Photoshop and tiled them up a little bit. I've got 3 in there, a dark one, a light one and a middle range one. We'll only use the dark one and the light one just for the moment. So let's select that one for this image and see what happens when it renders. Okay, in the shadow areas the cross hatching has appeared in there, and in our other image texture image here we'll get our lighter crosshatch in there, and watch and see what happens. So there, keying a light and a dark crosshatch texture into the area that's created by our 2D gradient. Now there's just one other thing that we can pull in, that we can do in here. You'll notice this is a very hard boundary here. If we were drawing this for real on a piece of paper, there's no way that we would have quite that hard boundary there. We can soften that by softening the blend here in between the two there. So we're getting a slightly more natural blend in between those 2 areas there. If I pull back from it so that we're not quite so close, and you'll see that that is in fact quite a convincing drawn crosshatch. Put the anti-aliasing up a little bit. Again, with this sort of texturing where you've got a very fine detail, you do need to put the anti-aliasing up quite a bit. If you want to play about with where this line falls, you can do that by shifting up the way there so that it tightens up a bit more, maybe up the way there, so our highlight area moves higher into there, so you could actually make that quite a nice highlight dot in there, almost simulating a Phong shader there. If you want to make it bigger, then you can bring it right down here. So you've got quite a lot of control there in the gradient shader as to how you deal with that. Again, as we mentioned with the half-toning that we looked at earlier, you could put a toon edge around there. We looked at some techniques for making that toon edge look very sketchy as well. That's a nice little technique as well. And that pretty much covers us for non-photorealistic rendering.